The fluorescent lights of the 42nd floor of Apex Global headquarters hummed with a cold, sterile efficiency that seemed to drain the very soul out of anyone who dared to work beneath them. For Arthur Pendleton, however, those lights were a beacon of survival, a harsh but necessary reality that kept food on the table and, more importantly, paid for the life-saving cardiac medication his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, desperately needed. Arthur was not a man of grand ambitions or loud declarations. He was a silent, invisible pillar of the company, working as a low-level data archivist, buried beneath mountains of digital ledgers and physical paperwork that the younger, tech-savvy executives deemed beneath their dignity. His hands were calloused, his eyes perpetually rimmed with dark circles of exhaustion, and his cheap, off-the-rack suit was fraying at the cuffs, but whenever he looked at the small, framed photograph of Lily sitting next to his computer monitor, all the weariness vanished. On this particular Tuesday morning, the office was gripped by a palpable, suffocating tension, as rumors had been circulating for weeks that the newly appointed chief executive officer, Victor Vance, was planning a radical restructuring of the company to boost short-term profit margins ahead of the annual shareholder meeting. Victor was a man born with a silver spoon, a ruthless legacy hire who viewed employees not as human beings with families, but as mere numbers on a spreadsheet that could be erased with a single stroke of his expensive fountain pen. He paraded through the office corridors like an emperor inspecting his peasants, flanked by a cohort of terrified junior executives and sycophants who laughed at his cruel jokes and nodded eagerly at his every whim. Arthur, conscious of the shifting tides, kept his head down, working feverishly to complete a complex analysis of the company's logistics data, desperately hoping that his flawless record of 10 years of loyal service would shield him from the impending storm. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the archives department swung open, and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Italian leather shoes echoed through the quiet room, signaling the arrival of Victor Vance himself. The CEO was a picture of arrogant opulence, dressed in a custom three-piece bespoke suit that cost more than Arthur's annual salary, his hair slicked back perfectly, and an expression of profound disdain etched onto his youthful, unlined face. He stopped right in front of Arthur's cubicle, tapping his manicured fingers on the partition wall while his entourage huddled behind him like a flock of nervous birds. Arthur immediately stood up, offering a polite, respectful nod, but Victor did not return the gesture, instead letting his gaze slowly sweep over Arthur's worn-out appearance, his faded tie, and the cheap plastic lunchbox sitting on the corner of the desk. With a sneer that dripped with condescension, Victor reached out and picked up the framed photograph of Lily, examining it with a cold, detached curiosity before tossing it carelessly back onto the desk, where the glass cracked slightly upon impact. Arthur's heart squeezed with a sudden, icy fear, not for himself, but for the fragile world he had built to protect his daughter. Victor then looked at his gold watch, sighed loudly, and asked Arthur what exactly he contributed to a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, his voice laced with a mocking tone that invited his followers to snicker behind their hands. Arthur, trying to keep his voice steady and professional despite the rising panic in his chest, began to explain his role in optimizing the company's supply chain records, highlighting how his meticulous archival work had saved the company millions in potential compliance fines over the past decade. But Victor didn't care about compliance, nor did he care about loyalty. He wanted a show of absolute power, a public sacrifice to demonstrate to the entire company that no one was safe, and that his word was law. He cut Arthur off mid-sentence with a dismissive wave of his hand, declaring in a booming voice that could be heard across the entire open-plan floor that Arthur's position was obsolete, his skills were redundant, and his presence was an eyesore to the modern, high-tech image he wanted to project for Apex Global. The entire office fell into a dead, terrified silence, all eyes locked on the tragic scene unfolding in the archives department as Victor, with a cruel, satisfied smirk, told Arthur that he was fired, effective immediately. Arthur's world shattered in an instant. He felt the air leave his lungs as he desperately tried to explain that he was a single father, that his daughter was sick, and that losing his health insurance right now would be a literal death sentence for her. But Victor only laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the glass walls, telling Arthur that his personal problems were not the company's concern and that if he wanted to keep a job, he should have worked harder instead of relying on charity and pity. The CEO ordered security to be called to escort Arthur out of the building like a common criminal, giving him exactly 10 minutes to pack up his decade of dedication into a single, flimsy cardboard box. As Arthur stood there, humiliated and broken-faced, surrounded by co-workers who looked away in shame and fear, he realized that humanity meant nothing in the face of unchecked corporate greed. He began to pack his few personal belongings with trembling hands, the cracked photo of Lily, a drawing she had made of them holding hands under a big yellow sun, a cheap mug she had gifted him for Father's Day, while the security guards stood over him like vultures. Victor Vance watched this agonizing process with a smug expression of absolute triumph, entirely unaware that the man he had just discarded so casually held a secret that would soon bring his entire empire crumbling down to the dust.